This is Joseph McBride. I'm a film critic and historian, and I'm going to do commentaries on 6 Buster Keaton shorts, and this is the first one I'm doing, The High Sign. And the reason I'm starting with this one, it's the first that he made as an independent. It was released by Metro, but it was with his Buster Keaton studio. It was made in 1920, but not released for more than a year. And he introduces his character in a very striking way, I think, as making sort of an existential statement of a guy coming from nowhere, being thrown off a train. He's in motion. He stumbles upon a merry-go-round. It sort of introduces the theme of him as a vagabond, constantly moving and encountering strange, unexpected situations and having to cope with them. This film was the first of the shorts that he made under his independent deal with the producer Joseph Schenck, but he wasn't satisfied with it. He felt it didn't quite come together as well as he wanted, and he didn't think it was as funny as he wanted, so he held on to it and didn't release it for more than a year. It turned out to be the 7th film he released, and he released it when he was having a product shortage because he had broken his ankle making a film called The Electric House, and he needed another film, so he put this out. But it's a very interesting short today in a lot of ways. The reason he didn't like it, it's a matter of speculation to some extent. One question is his character is a little less sympathetic, perhaps, than some of the other ones he played. Some of the things he does are a little more like the kind of lawless, anarchic thing that Charlie Chaplin became known for. For example, here he's going to steal the gun from this policeman, which is a little surprising for Buster Keaton, but the Chaplin character would have done that more. Now, in the background, you see Windward Avenue, and that's where Touch of Evil was shot, Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, right on that street. This is Venice, California, which was a famous movie location even in the silent days. It was built by an eccentric millionaire named Abbott Kinney as a replica of Venice, Italy. It was a resort, and he called it the Venice of America, and he had canals, and he had a pier and an amusement park. Some of this is still there, and you see it in a lot of films. In the early days, Max Sennett loved to shoot there, and Charlie Chaplin's first film, Kid Auto Races at Venice, was all shot there, as well as Tilly's Punctured Romance and other silent films such as King Vidor's The Crowd. Quite often when they wanted an amusement park, they would shoot in Venice. The film also perhaps has a somewhat more disjointed storyline than some of the other films. It's a little different in terms of its construction. There's a book, Keaton's Silent Shorts, by Gabriella Oldham, she thinks that the sight gags don't flow from the story but are hung on the plot more than organically derived from the character, and she thinks the character lacks inner depth and is somewhat unsympathetic. He becomes a bodyguard and hitman for the same person, which is a funny idea, but it doesn't quite pay off or work. Keaton's style as a filmmaker, he was a wonderful director. He worked with other directors, get co-credit often. And Eddie Klein is the guy who gets co-credit on most of the shorts, including this one. And he was a former actor and a very accomplished comedy director, went on to a good journeyman career as a feature director later on. But it's quite noticeable that whoever the director is working with Keaton, the films all have a very consistent visual style. So it's clear that Buster Keaton was the auteur and was definitely had a very strong visual sensibility and a way of working that other directors helped him achieve his vision, but they're very much his films. And he worked with good gag writers and other people. Clyde Bruckman was one of his gag writers, and Bruckman said that he almost felt bad about taking a paycheck because he felt that Buster Keaton did about 90% of the thinking in the films. But Keaton worked with a good team of people, and he needed helpers because his films are technically very complex. And when you're directing yourself, you really need somebody else to sort of tell you how the shot was and we should do it again or whatever. And he had a fellow named Fred Gaburi, who was his technical director, who did all the amazing mechanical things that Keaton needed for his props, primarily, such as the trick houses and various things. You'll see in this film, The High Sign, there's going to be a trick house that's quite amazing. This film has sort of a comical spin on a mafia-type gang. The high sign was a phrase, a slang expression that dates from about 1900. There was a secret sign or a signal that usually was intended to warn people about something. And so in this film, he has this silly thing where they do the hand gestures to give the high sign to show that they're members of the gang. And in this film, Bartine Burkett here plays Miss Nickel Nurser. She doesn't have much of a function in the story. She's not as interesting as some of the later Buster Keaton heroines, which may be another reason he was dissatisfied with it. But he had some terrific sight gags, as you'll see here with the dog and ringing the bell. Keaton loved mechanical gags. He was sort of mechanically minded. He came out of vaudeville, and from childhood on, he was a vaudevillian with his parents in an act called The Three Keatons. His parents were Joe and Myra Keaton. And vaudeville dealt extensively with props and playing around with objects and sets and gadgets, and so he became very mechanically oriented. And I think of him as sort of like an engineer at heart, kind of like a Howard Hawks, that they're very good at making things happen, and they just have a relish in showing processes of mechanical things and having fun with them, such as this gag where the dog rings the bell and makes people think that Buster is a great shot. And as in the best of silent films, gags build and build and build, and then they kind of surprise you, and this will pay off in a very funny way that things don't go exactly as he plans. I was mentioning the anarchic streak in Keaton. His worldview basically is that of kind of a sort of childlike guy who gets in situations that are almost over his head but is able to cope with them, and has to, in a very stoic way, just deal with whatever life throws at him, and life is quite crazy in his films. And that's one reason that he's beloved of the surrealists. The surrealist movement started around the same time Buster Keaton started making short films on his own. He had been working with Fatty Arbuckle as a supporting actor before this, and then he became quite adept in filmmaking and popular, and so he started making his own line of films when Arbuckle moved to a different company, and Keaton began working with Joseph Schenck, who was Arbuckle's producer. And Schenck was a very good producer for Keaton. He gave him a lot of freedom and allowed him to do what he did best. This film cost about $12,000, but Keaton, as I said, was dissatisfied with it, so he put it aside, and he released it. He made it in early 1920, but he released it in April 1921, which was the seventh of his shorts. And the reason he finally released it was he had broken his ankle working on a film called The Electric House, and so he was behind schedule and needed another film, and so he put this one out. And The Electric House was not finished until 1922. But today we look at this film, and it seems like a very good Keaton short. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly wrong with it, except that perhaps the plot gets a little convoluted. He gets hired to be a gangster to kill this fellow he's supposed to be protecting later on, but it takes a while to set up the plot. There they're doing the silly high sign. But Keaton's films often had plots that were kind of crazy, that didn't follow the conventional, straightforward line of development, which is part of the charm of his films, the surrealism of them, that the character goes from one thing to another, and then one crazy situation that he gets into, like this one, will lead him into another situation where he becomes a member of this gang. So he's sort of adrift in life, but he's able to cope very well with whatever life throws at him. Keaton's visual style is very elegant, very classical in one sense. He likes full shots, long shots, where you see the whole actor in the complete frame. And that's typical of a lot of the silent film comedians, because it's very important to see the whole actor. You don't just see parts of the actor. And Keaton said once, and Chaplin said something very similar to this, that comedy is life in long shot and tragedy is life in close-up. So when you see something like him standing there and then he gets knocked over the counter, it's funny. But if you'd cut to a big close-up of him with a suffering face, it would be more tragic. But it's very important for a comedian like Keaton, who's so physical, to let us see his whole body reacting to something. The gag he did drawing the hook, I think, is very funny and very surrealistic, and he loved doing that little gag with his hat. He had found the pork pie hat when he was working for Arbuckle, and that became one of his signatures, and he always loved to find gags revolving around the hat. So as a director, he would use the long shot to establish settings and props and to show you that everything worked. And he was very clear about what he was showing you. It's sort of like a magician will start an act by kind of showing you the props and showing you the setup and everything that's going to happen, and then playing games with you and doing things you don't expect. And Clyde Bruckman, who was one of Keaton's writers and sometime directors, said the guy's honesty was impressive. He wouldn't fool his audience. None of the easy camera tricks, cutting an action into several parts with a new camera angle for each, then splicing it all together. In the best Keaton scenes, some of the most amazing scenes are things that all happen in one take, one long shot. Here he's setting up sort of an intricate situation and playing riffs on it with the fact that he can't really shoot, but he's pretending to be a trick shot, and then he gets robbed here. It sort of backfires on him. And soon he will be found by Mr. Nickelnurser and his daughter and hired as a bodyguard because of his supposed prowess as a gunman, which he just sort of lucked into, but he's a bum and a drifter, and he just kind of found this occupation. Keaton came out of vaudeville, as I said, and his act as a kid revolved around a lot of physical bouncing around. He was, as a little child, thrown around by his father quite a lot on stage, and it was sort of comedy of child abuse, which today would not go over well at all, I'm sure. And even in those days, the authorities looked at it askance because they thought that there was something possibly very dangerous about it. And people today look at Keaton and they wonder if he was really a classical abused child. And the fact that he never smiled, which he arrived at as a vaudeville comedian, he explained as, well, here's a gag I just wanted to show you before we go into that. This, I find this very amusing. He has the banana peel, and then he confounds us by not slipping on it and then doing the high sign. And he didn't like that gag. I like it, but he said he thought he was being too clever. And in his book, My Wonderful World of Slapstick, he wrote that this was like thumbing my nose at the audience and saying, "Fooled you that time, didn't I?" In the end, I decided I'd made the mistake of outsmarting the audience a little too much. But instead of cutting this scene out, I added a shot. In this, after passing the camera and giving the sign, I slipped on a second banana peel and that somebody had dropped. That worked fine. That's not actually what happens in the film, so it's not clear if he had that in the film at one point or if he just thought he had put it in. But I think there's Windward Avenue there, the background you can see in Touch of Evil. That's the amusement park pier. I think it's actually kind of the fun of Keaton's films that he's playing games with the viewer. And if he's outsmarting the viewer, I think we have fun with that. He's a very intellectual comedian in a sense that he makes us think and he makes us try to keep ahead of him. And I think part of the fun is that he's smarter than we are in many ways in terms of his direction and his astonishing feats that he's able to pull off. And so when he outsmarts us. I think that's part of the pleasure of it, at least in my view. But he was a guy who believed in pleasing the audience, so I guess he was sensitive to the fact that he didn't want to show up the audience either. So it's a fine balance. And look at that, what he did with the hat is just astounding. I mean, a little gag, literally a throwaway gag like that, where he's able to do these astonishing feats, almost like a magician. We don't know how he does it, but he does it constantly and naturally. So you have a certain confidence in him that he can do anything, the most amazing feats. So here we have this trick house where the man is showing him all these escape hatches and secret passages and things like this. So he's doing what I said a magician does. He'll show you the props first before he starts doing things with them. And Keaton loved that kind of thing, a trick house. For example, in the movie 1 Week, one of his shorts that he made after this, but it came out first, is all about a crazy house that was built badly and everything doesn't work properly, but he makes it work. And in The Boat, it's another film about a crazy contraption. He builds a boat that doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to, but he has certain gimmicks that make it work. And The General with the train. So he loved the idea of some elaborate machine or device that his character has to cope with. And that's part of his, what I think of as engineering streak, that he's showing us what he can do with objects and mastering the most complicated pieces of machinery. So now the gang is going to go off after him. Here's the girl being very 1920, kind of almost pre-flapper girl with a little ukulele. And Keaton's view of women is interesting. There's a little sight gag with the coffee having a kick in it, surrealistic sight gag that Keaton loved, although he often would justify the gags in a little more realistic way than he did with that one. The girls in Keaton films are almost interchangeable, and in some ways you could say there's a certain sexism there, that the girls are not taken very seriously, they're not terribly interesting actresses. But in a way, I think audiences find it kind of refreshing today that he doesn't sort of moon over the girls like Chaplin did, and he doesn't romanticize them and sentimentalize them as much as we're used to in the old silent films. And he treats them in a kind of matter-of-fact way, almost kind of like pals or collaborators. This one is not a particularly good example because she's not as involved with him in any emotional way. She's just sort of there. But he certainly is not idealizing women or putting them on pedestals like was common in the early days of film, which tended to be a very Victorian view of women. So there's a kind of refreshing matter-of-factness to the way he deals with women in his films, which I think people respond to. Now we start seeing things where he's vanishing and having fun with the props. You see how he uses the whole frame and the masking effect of the frame, but it's very important to see him moving through the space, and he's a terrific director of space and objects like this. And here's a wonderful cutaway thing with a dual set with 2 levels, and he would use that kind of gag over and over again in his later films. He does all this quite well. Jumping through the mirror is a magical effect, and coming back out. That's the kind of thing he would do to some extent in vaudeville, but he would go further in films, because in films you can do more tricks with cutting and with different sets than you can on the stage. So he's able to do all kinds of magical effects using the properties of film. And this kind of thing is like an impossible gag that he has fun with. And now he cuts back to the long shot and goes out the window. He was an amazingly acrobatic actor, as you can see. His body was just able to do almost anything. He was about 5'5" or 5'6", and a terrific athlete. Now, this is just fantastic, the way he uses 4 levels. Everything is really happening, is not faked. And that's part of the idea of seeing the four rooms at once, that you can really see the entire scope of what he's doing and marvel at his agility. His athletic nature is one of the things that we really enjoy watching in films. Douglas Fairbanks was one of the more popular comic adventure actors at the time, and he did a lot of wild stunts also, but Keaton really outdid him. And Keaton did most of his own stunts, if not all of them. He was very proud of that, and he would take some real physical risks. And in one film actually broke his neck, even though he didn't realize it until later. So there is the end of The High Sign, which Keaton was not particularly satisfied with, but holds up rather well today.